Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. We are continuing with the section on science and does science prove atheism or does science disprove religion or God? And now we're continuing on from addressing some of the limitations of science. And I know this section is quite extensive, but it just goes to show how many limitations the scientific method has. However, one thing I want us to do is that although we are appreciating the limitations in the scope of science, they shouldn't create this mindset that we dislike science or we disapprove of science or science is useless. No, absolutely not. Science is a phenomenal method. When applied in the correct way and understood properly, it's a phenomenal method, and it's a beautiful tool that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, that we have the ability as human beings to engage in the scientific sphere and this method itself, because from a theophilosophical perspective, it allows us to appreciate the signs of Allah, engage with the signs of Allah. And when we engage with the signs of Allah, it leads to an appreciation of our Creator and it leads us to worship Him. So it's a beautiful method, and it reminds me of a very powerful ayah in the Quran where God says, "And we brought you out of your mother's wombs not knowing anything. And then we gave you hearing and sight and minds," af'idata, the word that's used, "so that you may be grateful." Now this is a very interesting ayah because Allah is telling us He brought us into this world not knowing anything, and then He refers to our senses. Allah says He gave us hearing and sight. These are the senses we use to make observations, and it's interesting because it reminds me of Bertrand Russell's quote, because he says science is an attempt to discover facts about the world by using observations, and I'm paraphrasing him, but using observations, and then reasoning upon your observations, he says. And interestingly here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us over 1400 years ago that He brought us into this world not knowing anything. And then He gave us hearing and sight, which are our senses, our sense organs, and minds, af'ida, minds. Sometimes it's referred to as hearts, but it's also used to refer to the mind. And there was always, historically speaking, a link that was made between the mind and the heart. So they were almost used interchangeably, although in recent history these two things have been split. However, the point is that Allah is telling us He gave us our sense organs and He gave us minds. And then why? So that we can be grateful. And if we think about this and reflect upon this, Allah is referring to our senses. How is having Allah giving us our senses and minds going to lead us to be grateful to Allah? Because Allah says so that we can be grateful. Now, if we reflect upon this, just some tadabbur, is that when we use our hearing and sight, we make observations, we take in information, then we reason, use our minds to reason upon these observations, think about these realities, we look at the world around us, the order within the world around us, we reflect upon it. This will lead us to acknowledge, that there is a Creator that put all of this in place, formulated all of this, constructed all of this, allows all of this to continue to function, this is very powerful. So in other words, it's almost as if, what Allah is pointing out in this ayah is what is referring to what we know as science, the method of science itself. Observations, use your senses to make observations, reason upon your observations and come to conclusions. But from our theological perspective, the greatest conclusion that one could come to is the realization that behind all of this is an all-powerful Creator. Behind all of this is a Creator who created all of this, is maintaining all of this, and is upholding and sustaining all of this. Therefore, it should lead us to be grateful to Him and to worship Him alone. So, it's very powerful when you look at it from this perspective. But anyway, without digressing too much, and actually let me continue to digress a bit further, because the next ayah, Allah says, "Do you not see the birds as they are held up in the skies?" Right? And this is very powerful again. And then Allah says, "None holds them up except Allah." And the reason I'm mentioning this, because it links to what we discussed in the previous session, which was to do with the how and the why of science. And I believe there's something we can take from this upon pondering. The ayah previous to this, Allah has told us He's given us our senses, He's given us our intellects so that we can be grateful. And then immediately there's a shift. Allah takes our focus to birds that are flying in the skies. We see birds all the time. Allah says, "Do you not see the birds, as they are upheld within the skies?" And I'm paraphrasing here, but it's almost like Allah now is immediately, after mentioning the faculties we've been given, is pointing us towards now using those faculties. Do you not see sight? Use your sight. Do you not see the birds flying in the sky? It's almost like observe the birds, study the how, the flight mechanism of birds. Do the study, do the science. But don't forget, fundamentally, none holds them up except Allah. That is the why. the ultimate why behind all of the hows. So, there's a very powerful way that Muslims or Muslim scientists, can draw parallels as far as the scientific method is concerned and what Allah is mentioning in these two ayat. And there are other ayat in the Quran which refer to, similar things, or which give us some insights as far as studying the physical world, doing observations, etc. But we may get to those in due course. But now we're going to continue with the limitations of science. Another limitation of science is frankly that there are other sources of knowledge. So therefore science isn't this one method that comprehensively addresses all spheres of knowledge, can tell you about all aspects of reality. No. For example, take this example. If you ask the question, did Genghis Khan exist, this historical figure, or did Plato exist, or did Aristotle exist? Now, we believe these are true historical figures, that these individuals actually did exist. But we don't believe that because of the fact that we have some sort of scientific proof for their existence. This is the realm of history, and it brings into play testimonial knowledge, right? We go off the works or writings of historical figures who spoke about these individuals, and that's where we get the knowledge of these individuals from. Testimony is another route to knowledge, authentic and valid testimony. And we don't need to go into detail here, but the point is that there are other routes to knowledge as opposed to science. So this idea that science is that ultimate method that tells us about all truths, or can lead us to all truths and deals with every sphere of life, is false. Is that science is limited to the physical world, things that can be observed, things that can be, studied physically, and data that can be collected via our senses, through observation. As far as other knowledge that we have and things that we believe in, such as certain historical figures, this is beyond the scope of science. This brings into play testimony, and testimony has a role to play within the scientific method too. Now, for example, it's not the case that every generation of scientists starts from scratch. Doesn't work like that. They receive testimonial knowledge from previous scientists and their works, and then they build upon that, right? The information, the testimony they receive from previous experts in the field, and that testimony may speak about experiments that those scientists did, but the scientist now in this generation that's reading the work of the previous scientists in that previous generation who did the experiments, they did the experiments. That scientist that's now reading this information is not necessarily doing all of the experimentations him or herself. So they're relying upon testimony, historical data, in other words, of other previous scientists. And that's how science progresses. I mean, if every single scientist was to start from scratch, there would be no progress, right? You wouldn't get anywhere. So there's a play of other routes or modes or methods of knowledge within the scope of science itself, right? So science isn't the only way to truth. So going back to the example of Genghis Khan, even if someone argues, well, we can get DNA of Genghis Khan and we could test that DNA. Well, even if you have DNA, even if somehow you can find the DNA of Genghis Khan or Plato or Aristotle, the problem is, it's still testimonial. Someone is telling you this is the DNA of this specific individual, and you have to go by that testimony, right? Sure, you could do the science, you could study the DNA, but that's not going to conclusively prove, even if you study the DNA, that this is the DNA of Genghis Khan. You have to rely upon testimonial knowledge. Science cannot prove necessary truths, right? Logical truths, such as syllogisms, right? Deductive arguments. Very simple deductive argument. All bachelors are unmarried men. John is a bachelor. Therefore, in conclusion, therefore John is an unmarried man. Now, this is a very simple syllogism. The premises are true and the conclusion is true. So let's just analyze this quickly. The premises, what are the premises? The first premise is all bachelors are unmarried men. Premise number one. Premise number two, John is a bachelor. Therefore, if all bachelors are unmarried men and John is a bachelor, in conclusion, therefore John is an unmarried man, right? So the logical relation between the premises and conclusions that we have deduced and we've thought about, that is something science can't tell you about. the logical links, the necessary logical links here. Science can't, this is beyond, this is not something that could be put into a test tube and studied, right? This is beyond the scope of science, right? But then again, there is a scope or realm where science relies upon this type of reasoning sometimes. Yet science cannot prove this type of reasoning scientifically. Although from a philosophical perspective, a deductive argument perspective, from the perspective of syllogisms, this holds. All bachelors are unmarried men. Now we can do the logic here. John is a bachelor, therefore in conclusion, it makes sense that John is an unmarried man, right? So it makes sense. But however, the logical link between the premises and the conclusion, those links and what's going on there, that stuff the cogs that turn within our minds when we do this, science can't explain this or make sense of this or test this in any way, shape or form. But yet, these are necessary truths. Science is self-defeating, or to be more specific, scientism is self-defeating. Now, what do I mean by scientism? Scientism is referring to the idea or a statement which an individual may make, which is that science is the only way to render truth about the world and reality. So science is the only way to render truth about the world and reality around us. This idea is self-defeating. If someone believes science is the only way to truth about the world and reality around us, if they make this particular claim and they believe this to be true, well, then this is false. Why? Because you cannot now take this statement that one is believing in, that science is the only way to truth about the world and the reality around us, and test this scientifically. Because if you believe in this statement, then that means you have to validate this statement scientifically too. You cannot do that. That statement is not something that could be tested via science. Again, you can't stick it into a test tube, and test it. Therefore, it's false, right? So it's self-defeating. It's like shooting yourself in the foot, literally shooting yourself in the foot. So brothers and sisters, we're going to stop here. And in the next session, we're going to look at this idea that science works. We've just covered the limitations of science. We're going to move on from that now. We're going to look at this idea that science works, the next assumption that science works, and therefore its conclusions are true. And we're going to sort of deconstruct this and break this down. So when you're ready, move on to the next video.